Good evening, everyone. My name is Matthew Patey. I'm a mobile engineer at Localytics, and I work on the client libraries that our customers ship in their apps. So Localytics is a user engagement platform, and that engagement is built on top of analytics. So that's one of the primary purposes of our client library. So let's see. So I'm going to be talking about Mock Server, and that is a tool that we built to help us test our client libraries. So first thing I'm going to do is step back a little bit and talk about kind of what led me to build this Mock Server tool and kind of like how I think about testing. So what any kind of testing, it comes down to you decide on what you want to test. That's a unit under test, and that is put that in a black box. You don't care about you don't make any assumptions about it. You just pass it some inputs, and then you can validate whether it gives you the right output. So you know if the output is right, then what the unit under test is working. If not, there's something wrong. So some quick terminology, just disclaimer that there's a lot of different definitions for all these terms that are used in testing. So I'm not going to say that the terms I use are correct. It's just I'm going to be consistent. So I'll give some definitions for how I use these terms. So here are some tools that help with testing, stubbing and mocking. So stubbing is a tool that helps you provide input to what you're testing. It lets you set up a fake thing, whether it be a fake object or a fake service that provides test data. So the unit under test can ask for this data as though it was interacting with a real thing in the production environment, even though it's actually this canned response that you set up. So an example would be if you're testing a method that pulls information out of a database, does a computation on it, and then gives you a value, you could stub out your database layer so that the getData method returns the test data. That way this input goes into the test happens, and then the output is whatever this method returns. On the other hand, mocking is a type of output from the unit under test, where you have this fake thing, this fake object. The mock will keep track of interactions that happen with it. So in that way you can say that the interactions the unit under test goes through is a type of output. So it will keep track of what interactions happen, if they're good, and if they are done in the correct way. Example is, again, with the database example, say you have a method you want to test that is testing. It takes some data, serializes it, sticks it into a database. So you can mock out the database layer's save data method. So you pass your method that you're testing the data, and then you make sure that it calls save data on the mock, and you can determine whether it passes in the correct information, that output. So, and again, often Blackbox testing is used to refer to a very specific type of testing. That's not what I mean here. Any kind of testing, any level of granularity, just you take the thing you're testing, put it in a black box, and you don't make assumptions about it. So here's some examples of different types of tests, all of them fitting into this black box. You have a unit test, you just take very, very small, very granular, you're testing a method of a class. So it's that method is the black box, you're giving it inputs through the method parameters, outputs return values, or other method calls that it makes if you're using mocks. If you go to functional test, a little more vague, you're just combining two or more units. It's a lot of big spectrum of what falls under this category. I would say this is a few classes that work together to perform a goal. So now you decide that these groups of classes, that's your unit under test, that's your black box. So your inputs might be a few method calls you make, and for your outputs you could check return values, you could check maybe I/O if it writes to a database, maybe there's some state change inside of that module, and then you can go up even higher to integration test. If you bring all the units together, all those modules, and for mobile you're testing your application. So whole app is the black box. You're not making any assumptions about how it works. All you care about is what the output is, what the UI shows you based on the input, which is coming from the user, in this case, the user interaction. So here's an example of what that might look like. This is an integration test for a mobile app. So here, the entire app is the unit under test. Here's the automation app driving that test. Now, what will often happen though is, because most mobile apps have a server, when you're writing these tests, they are still interacting with the real server, so really it becomes an end-to-end test because the server is also what's being tested. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because what you really care about in this instance is still the UI on the app, and the fact that the network requests are happening correctly can be determined because you're seeing the right thing in the UI. But it is the case that if this is not just testing your app anymore, it is testing the server as well. So, for example, if you have a messaging app and you're creating a new group of users to chat, and the UI doesn't update until the server returns a thumbs up that the group is created, well, if the server is doing something wrong or the network request fails, then this test is going to fail even if your app is doing everything correctly. So the Localytics client library is in a somewhat different situation than most of these apps. It is a library that goes embedded into our customers' apps. The application passes data into it, and then we package it up, send it up to our servers, at which point it actually passes through a SQS queue, so it doesn't get processed immediately. We don't get any immediate feedback from our server whether the data point was valid, if it was processed properly. So that kind of puts us in this position here, where we don't really have a UI to rely on. We can't say, oh, this UI updated so we know that it worked correctly. We don't have any other way to really say that this network request succeeded. So, and that's very important. That's definitely that's the primary purpose of the SDK, is to upload this data. So what we want to define in our integration tests, we have our whole client library inside the black box, inputs coming in from the public API, and then the outputs are those network requests as well as the public API, because you can pull some information out of it. So the way that so with that situation, this is how I want to be able to write a test. I'm using Objective-C iOS example here. We also do Android as well. So the first part is pretty straightforward. We're passing some data into the client library, and then we just want to make an assertion that the right data comes out if we ask for it. But the second part is a little more tricky. The second part is we're putting in a data point to be uploaded, and then we want to validate that the data point is correct, that it has the right information in it. So this is what we did to solve that problem. Here is a test application. In it is our SDK. The SDK is what's actually being tested here. The test suite is interacting with it through the public API, and then the SDK will send its network request to a HTTP server embedded in the test application. And because of that, the test suite can then ask that server for the request it receives. So here's what it looks like setting it up. We start up a new mock server, and then we figure out what port it's listening on, and we pass that into the client library calling setAnalyticsHost. And now, for anyone that yells at me, I know this is not actually a host, this is a host and a port. Technically we should have a setAnalyticsHost method and a setAnalyticsPort method, but this works, it's test code, so it's a little hacky. So now that we have our traffic being directed to this server, we can write the tests just like this, and at the bottom here, we can actually validate the request that we pull from the analytics server. And this is very useful for us because this is a real HTTP request. It's actually passed through the full HTTP stack. It is exactly the same as what our servers would receive, both the headers, the information inside the payload, so we can validate that it has the right event name, that the user email is correct, and all of this other stuff that we care about, making sure that we are actually generating the right kinds of network requests. So probably the biggest limitation of using this mock server is that you have to get your program to send the data to the mock server. So what we do is at runtime we figure out which host and port to send it to and tell our client library, hey, send your data over here. That's probably the best solution, but if you can't do that, there's also the possibility of, at compile time, figuring out, okay, I'm being compiled for this test, I will send my data to this specific port. That does create an additional challenge if you're using the same port for all of your tests. One is all of your test cases are sending their data to the same place, so you can't really determine which test case sent which data point. And additionally, if your test server is listening on the same port, if it's left open, then there's a timeout for that socket before you can listen to it again. So hopefully you can just pass it in at runtime. So if you're like the mobile team at Localytics and you're developing a product whose primary output is these network requests, then great, this is a very useful, can be very useful for you. But even if I know most mobile developers work on apps, but there's still a bunch of potential cases to use this tool. And basically any situation in which the correctness of a network request can't be seen in the UI. Some examples are a messaging app. A UI test can determine whether a message was received correctly and displays correctly, but you can't determine that sending a message gets to the other device. So you could use the mock server to capture that request and see that it properly sends the send message request. Or you have a client heartbeat used for the server to know which devices are online. There's probably no UI built in to show that, so you would use this to make sure that the correct requests are happening and they're happening at the right times. If you want to validate if you're using JSON, you want to validate the schema of your requests, you could use this, capture your request, pass it through a JSON schema validator. It has some use in unit testing. If you want to test your network layer, you can call send data on your network layer, make sure that it is actually sending what you want it to. Or maybe you're just a purist and you want to have your integration tests separate from your end-to-end tests. So you could have these end-to-end tests here, and you can also have your integration tests that truly isolate the application. So some other interesting next steps for mock server would be stubbing. So as I mentioned before, stubbing would be actually focusing on providing test data in addition to the mocking, which is validating that the unit under test is doing the correct thing. So it does definitely be useful if you want to do both mocking and stubbing. If you're trying to isolate your app for an integration test, chances are you need to be able to validate that the correct requests are coming out of it and also send in test data so the rest of the app can work. It can be used for some more complex stubbing because this is a full HTTP server, so you can set up a file server, for example, to be serving your stub data. And I did want to call out that there are some other open source stub libraries on iOS right now. You can find them on GitHub. And they focus on the passing test data to your application. They have some great tools around being able to set up which types of requests get which data. So if you find this interesting, you should definitely check those out. Those also have a lot of useful things that you can do there. So this is open source soon. I'm working right now to turn this into a library that'll be open sourced. Keep an eye on the Localytics engineering blog. I'll have a post up when I get this out. So thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Do we have questions? No questions? Okay, yeah.
Yes. So that's one advantage is that it's all inside the same process. So on iOS it's running in an XE test unit test case. So if an assertion is thrown by the validation code, then you have a breakpoint hit and your server is running there as well as your application is running right there, so you can debug it that way.